San Francisco has always had a reputation as being a countercultural haven, and it was no different in the mid-1800s when Mark Twain arrived in the Bay City. And it was the boisterous nature and bohemian lifestyle of San Francisco that author Ben Tarnoff said shaped the writing style of not only Twain, but other American literati as well. It is all outlined in Tarnoff's book. It is called The Bohemians, Mark Twain and the San Francisco Writers Who Reinvented American Literature. Ben Tarnoff is with me here now in our studio. Hello, welcome to the Agenda in the Summer.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's go back to mid-19th century. We're talking Civil War time. What kind of literary scene existed in the U.S. at the time?
Well, the United States, really, the literary establishment is focused on New England, and it has been for decades at that point. You have writers like Emerson, Longfellow, Lowell, and there's really a sense that New England has a kind of cultural chokehold over the rest of the country. So what's happening in the West, and particularly in San Francisco, is that a handful of young, unorthodox writers, including Mark Twain, are trying to challenge the East for cultural supremacy and trying to develop some of their own types of writing.
And so they exist in the city that, as you say, sort of based around this counterculture. What is San Francisco like at the time, the city itself?
Well, San Francisco in the 1860s, it's big, it's rich, and it's cosmopolitan. And it's also in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's all the way out there on the far California coast. It's very difficult to get to San Francisco from the rest of the country. And that isolation creates kind of a buffer from the standards of the Eastern establishment. It allows young writers to be a little bit freer in how they write, a little freer to experiment. But the fact of its prosperity, San Francisco is such a rich town. It's the really industrial, commercial, and financial center of the region. And all of that wealth helps finance a range of print publications that allow a class of professional writers to emerge. So Twain and others can make a living off of writing, and that really allows this literary scene to develop.
So it's really fertile ground for writers. You got economics to pay, and you've got the freedom to write what you want.
Exactly. And it's such a unique social experiment that's happening out there. You know, there's a very international population in San Francisco. You have people from China, you have people from South America, from many countries in Europe, from Australia. And that global mix creates a new type of cultural experience that really does feed into this literary scene.
We use this term Bohemians, I mean, in sort of everyday language. Your book is called The Bohemians. What are we talking about? What is a Bohemian?
Well, the term first emerges in Paris, actually, in the 1830s, and then it migrates to New York. And it refers to, you know, what we think of today as kind of a tribe of poor artists who are hanging out in cafes. In San Francisco, it acquires a slightly different meaning because Bret Harte, who is a young writer who's Twain's contemporary and friend and rival, really is the leader of this bohemian scene. And the way he uses the term is not to describe a lifestyle so much as a countercultural space outside of the mainstream, a kind of rallying cry for the young, eccentric writers of California to do something differently in American literature.
Bret Harte, you said we're going to talk about him in a minute, but he self-identifies as a bohemian. Does Twain, do the others that you write about, they all say, yep, we're bohemians?
Yeah, they do identify as bohemians, but again, they're not living like bohemians. I mean, Twain is a little bit, certainly. He kind of lives large and is always in debt and drinks heavily, but Harte certainly doesn't. He has a day job at the San Francisco Mint. He has a wife. He has an infant son. So it doesn't describe so much the bohemian lifestyle as it does this attempt to do something new and to challenge the orthodoxies of the literary establishment.
You write in your book about four writers, Twain, obviously, well-known, Harte, and two others that we'll talk about individually. I wanted to start with Harte. So you say he's sort of this, you know, average guy, is that fair to say? Raising a family, raising children, having a wife, not out drinking and partying all night. What's his sort of, given that's sort of the lifestyle he's leading, what's sort of his approach to writing?
Well, what Harte sees very early on is that California has a unique opportunity to create a new type of writing. He talks about looking at California society as a mix of all of these different cultures from all over the world, living, as he calls it, free from the trammels of precedent on the far edge of the world. So it's a freer place. It's a place where pre-existing institutions, they're not really there as in the East. And so writers can take this new fuel, really, these new building blocks that exist and create a new literary style.
And what's he writing about?
Well, Harte's real breakthrough comes in a series of short stories about the gold rush. And what's so interesting and unique about those stories is that he's taking a deeper use of dialect, of the American vernacular, and really trying to unlock the imaginative richness of it, to try to see the vernacular not as a corruption of proper English, but as a more creative rendering of it with its own unique potential.
Okay, so we're 1860s-ish is when he's sort of
exactly,
popular.
1860s, 70s.
Nowadays, I mean, everyone could name Mark Twain. Very few people could probably name Bret Hart. Was he a popular writer at the time? Was he well-known, well-established?
So Bret Hart, for a brief period, becomes the most famous and most highly paid writer in America. In 1871, he leaves San Francisco, goes to the East Coast, and takes a job as an exclusive contributor to the Atlantic Monthly for $10,000 a year, which is unheard of sum at that point for a professional writer. But after that, Hart completely self-destructs. You know, he has this rapid rise and rapid fall. He finds that he can't write in the East Coast. He goes deeply into debt. He burns all of his bridges. His friends won't talk to him. So he really goes into this sharp decline. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we don't know him as much as we do Twain, who in that same period really takes off and becomes the supreme cultural icon of post-war America.
Okay, we'll talk a lot about Twain in a couple of minutes, but I want to focus on another person you write about in your book, a woman, Ina Coolbrith. I thought her name was Ina, but it's Ina, right?
Ina, yeah.
Okay, Ina Coolbrith. Tell me about her.
Well, Ina Coolbrith, she endures a lifetime of tragedy at an early age. By the time she's 21, she's had a terrible divorce from this abusive husband. She's endured the death of her infant child. And she moves from Los Angeles, where she's been living at the time, to San Francisco to bury her past and start over. And she starts writing poetry and publishing it in these local papers of the San Francisco literary scene. And this brings her into contact with the other Bohemians. And she, in particular, she and Bret Hart become very close friends and build this scene in these papers that will create really a national audience for the Bohemian movement.
She's a woman, obviously. I mean, how common was it for women writers to be part of the Bohemian scene at that time?
Well, I think San Francisco has a bit of a freer cultural climate. I mean, the other thing about San Francisco and the far west in general is that it's very male, because the legacy of the gold rush has created a real imbalance in the genders. So women, I think, occupy a slightly different position in California than they would in the East. But I think the fact that someone like Coolbrith could rise to such a high place of prominence within the California literary scene is a real testament to the fact that the culture there was a bit more fluid. You know, it was open to new influences. It wasn't as constrained as the literary establishment in the East.
And then we have Charles Stoddard, who you also write about. What's his story?
Well, Charles Stoddard is the boy wonder of the Bohemians. He's a young, shy writer, and like Coolbrith, he starts publishing poems in the local papers and starts befriending these other Bohemians. And Stoddard is gay, he's homosexual, and he is struggling really to square his sexuality with a world that offers very few outlets for it. I mean, even the term homosexuality doesn't exist until 1869. So he's struggling to define himself in this period. And what ends up happening, his real breakthrough comes when he travels to Hawaii, where he spends a lot of time and has love affairs with many local Hawaiians, but also writes these wonderful travel sketches that are collected into a book called South Sea Idyls. So he really, in the Twain tradition, writes this kind of anti-travelogue, this very ironic, sly, funny series of pieces about his adventures overseas.
So Stoddard doesn't really get success till he leaves San Francisco. Ina Coolbrith, you know, unique in that she's a woman writer in a very male-dominated era of that time. How are these two, I mean, the establishment sort of isn't respectful of either of these, if I can use that word, being gay or being a woman writer at the time. How are they treated by the rest of the literary establishment, beyond the Bohemians?
Well, Stoddard briefly has a moment where he gets some recognition from the Eastern establishment. And I think if he had pushed through, you know, if after the publication of his book, South Sea Idyls in 1873, if he had followed it up with more books and more pieces in that line, it's possible he could have achieved maybe not the status of a Mark Twain, but somewhere, you know, half of that. The thing with Stoddard is that he has so many of his own personal struggles, and so much ambivalence about writing and his own life and his own life choices that he basically spends much of his life wandering. He lives this very itinerant lifestyle. He wanders throughout Europe when he's very poor. When he comes back to the United States, he wanders throughout the United States and teaches and kind of picks up gigs. So their own personal struggles also confine their ability to succeed at the national level.
It's interesting because all the four people that you write about in your book, approach life in very different ways, have very different experiences. One's sort of a wanderer, one has tragedy, one is sort of upstanding and lives a quote-unquote regular life. Are they all just drawn together for being bohemians and wanting to be countercultural?
I think that's a great question. The thing is, there's no house style to the Bohemians. There's not one thing that unites them absolutely, except for what you mentioned, which is this sense of not belonging anywhere else. They're all nonconformists, either by choice or by circumstance. Charles Stoddard, didn't get to choose to be a nonconformist. It was just kind of built in. Twain certainly did. But all of them share this sense that they don't quite belong to the establishment. And I think that creates a real sense of solidarity among them.
I want to talk a lot about Twain. One of the most interesting things I found about the book was that you kind of challenged everything that I didn't know much, but what I thought I knew about Twain and sort of this image I have of him. Your book concentrates on parts of him that most of us don't know about. Twain's not even from San Francisco. Why does he go there in the first place? What attracts him to him?
Well, Twain initially goes west from his home state of Missouri because the Civil War breaks out in 1861. And at that point, he's a pilot, actually, on the Mississippi. And the war shuts down river traffic. So he has to leave the Mississippi, and he also wants to leave Missouri because Missouri as a border state is a very dangerous place to be at the beginning of the Civil War. You have both Union and Confederate draft agents going door to door, pressing young men into service, whether they wanted to or not. So Twain decides to go west with his brother Orion, who's just been appointed secretary to the territorial governor of Nevada. So they go west in 1861, and Twain spends a few years in Nevada, in the Virginia City area, which is a Comstock boom town. It's really the place where a lot of the silver and gold of the region is being extracted, and it has kind of a wild frontier atmosphere. Twain decides to move to San Francisco permanently in the spring of 1864.
How old is he then?
By then, well, he's in his mid-20s.
Okay.
And by the time he moves to San Francisco, he's decided that he needs something else, that he wants to achieve a little bit more fame, make a little bit more money. And it's a natural progression for a writer. So he's very ambitious from an early age.
And what was his early life like growing up? What kind of family did he come from?
Well, he grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, which of course he draws from a lot in Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And he becomes a typesetter at an early age. And this really brings him into the world of writing. Benjamin Franklin called typesetting the poor boys' college. It was an opportunity for young men of modest means to acquire some type of education and also to be given the opportunity to write. Because as he's working in the print room from an early age, from 15, he is given the opportunity to write a few humor sketches and see them published. So he gets addicted to seeing his name in print. And although he has this interlude where he's a Mississippi steamboat pilot, the idea of a writing life appeals to him from an early age.
So he doesn't have much or any formal education. He's self-taught by doing job typesetting.
That's right. Really, none of the characters in my book have much formal education, a few years at the most. And many of them, their education really comes through this exposure to newspapers. The print room is really their college. And newspapers and this explosion of print media that's happening in America in the 19th century is so critical for this generation of writers, because it's not only giving them exposure to reading and writing, it's giving them jobs, employment either as typesetters or writers. It's also giving them an opportunity to reach an audience, because this national newspaper network is emerging.
And it's establishing itself, and it's respectful. Just talk to me a little bit more about the kinds of publications we're seeing, the kinds of access that these writers had to them.
Well, I think the best analogy is that it's kind of like an analog internet, where you have the newspaper network of 19th century America. You have a few big nodes in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, and then a number of smaller papers distributed throughout the country. And they're interconnected both by roads, certainly by telegraph networks, by railroad networks, all of which increase hugely after the Civil War. So it's very tempting for a writer to publish something in the hopes that it will go viral, essentially. And that's actually how Mark Twain first becomes a household name. He publishes a sketch called Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog in 1865 when he's living in California. It actually appears in a New York paper, and then it goes viral. It's picked up by all of these different newspapers across America's newspaper network. So a bit like the internet today, it gives young writers an opportunity to reach a mass audience.
So he writes that in 65, Civil War ends in 65. What effect did the Civil War have on Twain and the other Bohemians?
Well, California is insulated from the Civil War, so no serious fighting reaches the coast, and Lincoln never applies the draft west of Iowa and Kansas. California, however, definitely experiences the Civil War culturally because it's this huge cultural shift that's happening throughout the country. And in fact, the biggest impact in California is its sense of belonging to the Union. You know, California, from its earliest days, didn't feel that American. It's a very cosmopolitan place, very global place. It's very isolated. It's very hard to get there from the rest of the country. So they don't feel particularly connected to the Washington government. And what the Civil War does is it inspires a new spirit of patriotism in California. It really brings the country together, both spiritually and physically, in the form of these rail networks, because by 1869, you have the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is a major factor in the development of the West Coast.
And this all seeps into how it influences the Bohemians, what's going on sort of on a more macro level. They're soaking this all up. How's it affecting their writing?
Well, they belong to this younger generation that's coming of age with the Civil War, because one of the things the Civil War does is it upends conventional wisdom of all kinds, whether on the battlefield or the boardroom. You know, in military, in politics, in business, all of the rules are being rewritten. And it's really this younger generation that's doing it, whether it's Ulysses S. Grant or Mark Twain. So they take advantage of this new cultural era that's emerging, you know, the cracks that are emerging in this older literary establishment. And so it's a great time to be a young, eccentric writer.
What's your sense? I mean, did they know it was a great time? Like they're sort of like, hey, here's this great opportunity. Let's seize it. Let's go with it. Or are they sort of stumbling upon finding their way?
I think they're stumbling a bit. I mean, I think writers and artists are often not the most articulate when it comes to talking about their own work, and certainly when talking about what makes their work most revolutionary or most interesting. And Twain certainly falls into that category. It's kind of up to his friends and critics to point out what makes his work so interesting.
And as you said at the beginning of our conversation, I mean, the literary scene's really happening on the Eastern Seaboard there. That's where how are they sort of, the Twains and the Bohemians work within that context being accepted around America?
Well, it is this love-hate relationship, I would say, between West and East, where, you know, if you're a young writer in the West, you're trying to do something differently from the literary establishment centered on New England, but you're also desperate for that approval. And Twain certainly embodies that contradiction, where on the one hand, he wants to be accepted by cultural elites. He desperately wants the approval of an institution like the Atlantic Monthly, for instance, which really represents the pinnacle of a certain type of high culture in America. On the other hand, he's clearly very committed to developing new forms, you know, taking the stories and settings and characters and slang of the West and turning them into art, which is a completely different departure for American literature.
So he sort of wants to be revolutionary but accepted by the establishment.
Exactly, exactly.
Sounds familiar in modern day context. So Twain, Stoddard, Coolbrith, they're all hanging out together. Are they're friends? Are they competitive? Is there lots of competition?
There is a lot of competition, and I think this happens particularly between Mark Twain and Bret Hart, where they form a complex love-hate relationship from an early stage because they're both about the same age and they're both trying to do roughly the same thing, which is to become a successful Western writer on the national stage. So they help each other quite a bit. Hart is invaluable to Twain as an editor of his work and really as a mentor figure as well. And Twain returns the favor later in life. But that strain of competition, it's always present throughout their friendship, and it also contributes to the end of their friendship because because eventually it kind of blows up and they become bitter enemies for the
What does
rest
it
of their
blow up
lives.
over?
Well, it's controversial. According to Twain, by 1878, their friendship ends, basically. And at that point, Hart's career has completely self-destructed and he desperately needs money. So he's asked Twain to co-write a play with him in the hopes that it'll raise some revenue because Hart's got a family to feed. And according to Twain, when Hart was staying in Twain's house in Hartford, he made all sorts of sarcastic remarks about everything in the house, from the flatware to the things hanging on the wall, and that he finally said something disparaging about Twain's wife, Livy. And that provoked this huge outburst from Twain. So that's his point of view on it.
So Twain and Hart, they both leave San Francisco. They go east. How again, I kind of go back to when I say Mark Twain, you see Huck Finn, right? That's how this sort of works. How did Twain's experience in San Francisco influence his more famous work, like Huck Finn, like Tom Sawyer?
Well, what Twain finds in the West is he discovers how to unlock the literary potential of all of these elements that have been with him from an early age. Because, of course, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer are drawn from memories of Missouri, of Hannibal in particular. So the frontier, really, has always been with him in all of its forms, from the rich irony of its storytelling to its rambling flow, to this incredibly imaginative slang and the kind of homespun intelligence that's really embedded in the American vernacular. So that's been in his subconscious really his whole life. But in California, he finds a way to access it. Particularly through this sketch, Jim Smiling as Jumping Frog, you see him finally starting to put those materials and make them into art for the first time.
Why does Twain stick with us in like our sort of even popular imaginations where Stoddart, Coolbrith, Hart just don't?
It's a good question. I'm not totally sure. I think partly it has to do with his relentlessness. You know, he's always trying to find new genres. He does everything from science fiction. He has a very big career as a stand-up comedian. You know, he's on the lecture circuit constantly. He's a great travel writer. He's a memoirist. So he kind of does everything. And that's a testament partly to his work ethic and to his restlessness. But I think he also found a way to connect to an America that was transforming itself in the decades after the Civil War. He really found a way to embody this American spirit that is coming out of these transformations that we've been talking about in the 1860s.
We are, about 150 years on from the time in which they lived. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about American literature of today and sort of comparing it to American literature of the past. But in our final few minutes, I mean, how would you characterize the Bohemians' legacy? What would you say is sort of their lasting legacy?
Well, I think the legacy lives on most powerfully through Mark Twain. And Twain's biggest contribution to really modernizing American literature is this attention to dialect, to how living American speech is spoken, and to all of its idiosyncrasies, and to all of the metaphors and similes, and all of the things that we may not think of mostly as good material for art, but he really recognizes, in fact, this is a rich treasure trove of a new art form.
And what should we take away from the others, from the Stoddart to Coolbrith? What do you think their legacy is, if any?
Well, I think Hart contributes to that powerfully. I mean, I think before Twain is really a major figure on the national scene, it's really Hart who is teaching Americans about the literary power of Western materials, of Western settings, of this slang. So I think Hart deserves a lot of credit. I think for Coolbrith and Stoddart, their legacy is a bit harder to see because they'd never achieved quite that level of success.
Okay, we're going to talk about how the legacy of these four kind of plays out today when I talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.